There's a kind of empowerment that costs you nothing and it gives you everything. I was terrified. I had dry mouth. I could barely speak. No can be a complete sentence. You don't owe anyone an explanation. Empowerment without soul is a starvation. She finally stops questioning who she's allowed to be. That woman is you. There comes a point in the second half of life when a woman realizes she's been asking everyone but herself what she should do, what she should want, who she should be. And the day she begins to see how often she does this is the day something old begins to give way. Too many midlife women have spent decades looking outside of themselves for answers their soul has been trying to communicate with them and holding for them all along. Not because we're foolish, but because this is what we've been trained and acculturated to do. We hear a lot about the trap of people pleasing, but there's a kind of empowerment that truly stops that pattern, and it costs you nothing, and it gives you back absolutely everything. There's also a kind of humility almost no one talks about that is the true doorway to that empowerment. We're not talking about becoming more assertive or louder or hardened within yourself. This is something far more subtle and far more powerful. Welcome to Soul Knows the Way, a podcast for women in the second half of life who sense a soul hunger they can no longer ignore, a longing for depth, truth, and a life lived from the inside out. I'm Kim Marie, soul guide and author, and I'm here to walk that journey with you. Let's explore how to let go of people pleasing and reclaim more of your empowered, sovereign self. In our last conversation, we explored key number 2, the empty key. This is part of the 7 keys to reclaim your soul. If you have not downloaded your completely free copy, be sure to do so. The link is in the description or the show notes. Today, we're moving to that 3rd key of the 7 keys, and it picks up exactly where emptying leaves off. Because once we begin to realize what's not ours to carry, something in us begins to recognize more of our true self, and we become ready to claim her. We'll go into the details of what key number 3, the claim key, is all about in a moment. First, I want to explore what it feels like when this key's been missing for most of a lifetime, which is true for many of us. So many of us have been living without it for so long that we may not even fully recognize the cost of doing so. So here's what that begins to look like, or maybe you'll recognize yourself in some of these things that indicate that this claim key is needed to help you unlock more of your own soul wisdom. Maybe you've had never-ending exhaustion that just doesn't seem to disappear. Or maybe you're constantly scanning what others need from you, wondering what others are thinking, worried if somebody needs something or is thinking something about you. Maybe there's a decision you can't quite make, you aren't quite willing to dive into, but something in you already knows the answer. Maybe you catch yourself asking 2, 3, 4 people before you make a decision instead of trusting your own answer, instead of just knowing and believing in your own inner wisdom. Maybe you have gotten trapped in believing a million other voices over your own. And let's face it, there are tons of voices out there basically yapping at us in every direction. Whether it's media, advertisement, marketing, billboards. I mean, it's everywhere that these voices are coming at us. And it can be very easy to believe that, well, gosh, if that's what everybody else is saying and thinking, maybe there's something wrong with what I'm thinking because it doesn't seem to fit that picture. We might even look back at the last year or 2 of our lives, maybe more, unsure of whose life we were living. We might feel a nagging self-doubt when we know we've made a good choice, we've made a good decision, and we still can't stop questioning whether it really was the right decision, or what if we had chosen something else. There may be a persistent powerlessness that just doesn't match the competent woman everyone else sees. I work with a lot of women who share with me that they know how competent they are. They recognize their abilities on many levels, and they're constantly told how skilled and talented they are and how valued they are. Everyone sees it. Everyone is amazed by it. But they keep questioning, like, could that possibly be true? Could that possibly be what is real? And maybe you catch yourself saying yes when your soul was clearly wanting to say no. And it's a small betrayal that gets left behind within you. I want to share a bit of my own example or examples of how this has shown up, because I'm not immune either. I'm on this journey with every one of you, and it's a constant learning. It's a constant process. It is a journey. It's a growth. It's an evolving, an evolution of our own consciousness, our own path forward. In the first half of my life, just like with most of us, the ego led the way. Our ego tends to lead the way in the first half of life. Typically our lower ego. It's looking for its place in the world. It's looking for a sense of self and individuation of who it is. And I know for me, you could say, was wandering through a lot of my first half of life, wondering how to fit in, be accepted, find my place. And as a result, really wanting to be accepted, wanting to find my place. Of course, I fell into the trap that so many of us do of people pleasing, overgiving, tending to all the shoulds and the expectations, whether they were actual expectations or just my perceived expectations of what the world or others wanted of me. And eventually, I started realizing the tremendous cost of this behavior, of people pleasing, of overgiving. I started to see what I lost in the process of doing that. I had ultimately abandoned myself, my values, my own intuitive connection for the sake of this external acceptance or approval that I thought I was getting by people pleasing and overgiving, but quickly learned that I wasn't really getting anything along those lines. In fact, I was bypassing the very things that I was supposed to be getting from my own inner wisdom, from my own soul's wisdom. Okay. And I realized that I had outsourced so much. I had outsourced my own authority, my own inner authority. I'd outsourced my direction and sense of self-worth and inner wisdom. The sense of self-worth is a big one for many of us. As I entered the second act of my life, I grew very tired of this after realizing the cost. And I started to question everything. I began distrusting pretty much all outer authority. Sometimes even throwing the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, just not remembering that I still needed to ask for help at times, that I still had things that I needed to have guidance around. We all do. And yet there can be this sort of transitional time shifting into the second act of our lives that causes us to want to just abandon everything that we've done before. And this transitional time can cause us to start, for sure, challenging the status quo and definitely not really understand what's going on and feel really uncomfortable in ourselves. It's part of that transition, and it's perfectly normal. And I experienced it too. I started shaking literally within myself as I stood up for myself more and spoke up. I was terrified, not knowing how I'd be received, and yet knowing that I really had to speak up. I had to say something. I had to stand up for myself or others, whatever it was. I started taking risks I never would have thought were acceptable before. I started challenging so much in the outer world that I had kind of accepted in the past, or even if begrudgingly accepted. And I started creating so much more. I had such a different kind of creative energy, especially as I hit menopause and started realizing this creative force was now not going to create an external birth, but rather I had this capacity to birth new things within me. And I had this deep longing to simply be me, fully me. And I realized that many of these discomforts, many of these feelings were alleviated through practice. I had to practice standing up to authority. And one of my favorite examples that I think was one of the most powerful, I have two main ones. I'm actually going to share them both with you. But one was I had gone through a health challenge, and maybe in another video I'll share more about the details of that. But I had gone through multiple surgeries at this point and not successful. And I started to realize I felt like I was being led astray by the medical establishment. I needed to have another surgery, but I wanted this to be the absolute last. And I decided that I was going to take the reins. My soul was going to lead the way. I was no longer going to let the lower ego that could become very quickly afraid in the face of authority lead the way. And I was going to interview multiple surgeons. And I interviewed 21 surgeons. I questioned them. I was absolutely terrified in the meetings. I had dry mouth. I could barely speak. I found myself shaking and quivering, literally. I was definitely not well received initially, but as I went on and kept aligning with my soul lit up more and more. It was willing to take chances. It was willing to show up and lead the way because I was allowing it to, no matter how uncomfortable my lower ego was letting go of the reins. By meeting number 21, I was so confident. I was so clear. I was able to speak what I needed, to say what I did not need, to let them know that, yep, you're not the one for me. And I ended up choosing an amazing surgeon, and knock on wood, that was 6 years ago. So I have not had an issue since. And sometimes that's what we have to do to advocate for ourselves. Sometimes it takes a lot longer. I mean, those interviews took months for me to go through. I had to be really patient and wait for the surgery, wait to get the right person. But that was nothing compared to my divorce experience, actually, and coming to realize my own sovereignty through my divorce years. In the beginning, we had actually a wonderful divorce agreement. It was very well orchestrated. The judge complimented us on how thoughtful we were about our children. It was an amicable divorce. We didn't hire attorneys and things like that. And then later on, I think out of fear, out of that lower ego, oh my goodness, what am I doing? My husband, as I affectionately call him, was kind of pulling some things that were just not him. They weren't himself. And I had to ultimately stand my ground and remind him of the agreements that we had, remind him that this is not what is in the agreements, and just doing my best to hold that with a sense of love, but with a sense of no, you're not going to push me around. You're not going to do this. This is not acceptable. This is not okay. And I held my ground for a very long time. Now, I've been divorced for 18 years. But it took about 10 years of holding my ground, knowing that he had certain animosities, but still feeling that appreciation and focusing on the agreements, trusting in the agreements. It took about 10 years before there was an ability to have that more amicable relationship again, to feel that and to realize that I was actually respected for holding my ground, for being real, for being truthful, for not going into the reactivity and fighting fire with fire. But my relationship, I feel, became better than it had been in the early divorce years. For many of us, this pattern of people-pleasing and outsourcing our authority is so old, it's become the water that we swim in. We don't remember who we were before it. And remembering, really remembering, is the beginning of the journey home. We must remember who we are beyond the roles and the outside expectations in order to claim our sense of sovereignty and soul fulfillment. This is why remembering is actually the first stage of the work I walk women through in my Solace program. It's an ongoing sacred sanctuary for women aligning with soul. You can check out the link in the description if you want more details on that. But ultimately, when we start to remember who we are, our entire life can unfold in new ways that we might never have imagined before. The second half of life brings a higher cost to that outsourcing. The cost grows steeper, bigger, because the second half of life is actually calling us to a very powerful time of creation. It also is a time when the time and space for our own life begins to narrow. We start to become very aware that life is short and it's not worth messing around with a lot of these other things. I've certainly felt that in my second act. I am so much less willing to put up with BS. I am so much less willing to deal with the nonsense. And I want to just focus on things that are truly aligned with meaning and a sense of purpose and values. The soul's voice becomes harder to ignore. And I think that cost of people pleasing, of outsourcing our authority, all of that becomes that much more obvious or painful because the soul's voice is really nudging us during that time. And the patterns that worked in the first half of life stop working. And we kind of feel like a ship without a sail. Our soul sickness deepens if we go on betraying our knowing and our true path. I talked a lot about soul sickness in the very first episode of this podcast, if you want to go back and check that out. Also in the second half of life, our ego is, as I mentioned, the lower ego in particular, is loosening its grip. It's allowing the soul to take the reins. Now, we need an ego. We're not trying to get rid of the ego. The ego is what makes us distinct from other creatures on this planet. No other creature has an ego, a capacity to reason, a capacity for the logic, a capacity for freedom of choice. There's really more of an operating on instinct, instinctual behavior in other animal beings, and the human being is distinct. And yet, while we want to tap into this higher ego essence of our truth, our true self, our capacity for freedom, the lower ego, trying to find its place in the first half of life, often holds on very, very tightly. And thankfully, in the second half, whether it's because the soul starts to get a little louder or more insistent, or because our higher ego starts to recognize that it needs to be at the forefront without all of these lower ego fears and doubts and self-questioning and things like that. So we start to have an ability to have the soul come to the forefront. We don't want to ignore this opportunity. I think when we're given these kinds of opportunities, when we ignore them, the consequences become much bigger. Now, the world at large would give us, as always, the wrong medicine. It's going to tell us to be more confident, be more assertive, assert yourself, be more aligned with what you want, be more empowered in the conventional sense of what many people think of as empowerment. Now, conventional empowerment, as it often gets called, and I think why so many people get uncomfortable with this, often is without soul. And that becomes another form of striving, another form of performance for outer approval. It's just dressed in different clothing. Empowerment without soul is really a starvation. It's an impoverishment of our being, and it often shows up as power over, including power over our own soul, power over our own self, our own true self. And that's really unfortunate, rather than that sense of true empowerment that our soul is trying to help us have in union with spirit. This is what soul sickness looks like with our excessive people-pleasing and betrayal of our soul. And it doesn't get better on its own. Years of your own life lived by everyone else's script, those are done. No more paying the price of staying where you've been. It's time for us to step into our own unique, beautiful soul path. And every one of us has a unique path. This claiming of our sovereignty is not power over anyone or anything. It's the humble, generative act of taking back the wisdom and worth that we've been outsourcing and learning to stand in the fullness of who we already are and always have been. Your soul never needed permission, approval, or validation from anyone else. Only the lower ego did. The soul has been waiting for you to remember. And I've come to believe that the second half of life is the perfect opportunity to align with our soul. Now, I want to talk a little bit about that concept of humble, of humility, because there's a huge cultural misunderstanding that humility is about making ourselves small, deferring, not taking up space. This has often come from religious dogma, this idea that we're unworthy, that to be humble and pious and all is to stay quiet, to stay in the background, to not make waves, because we're sinners, because we're not worthy. Now, to sin actually means simply, in its literal or original form, to miss the mark. And as human beings who are still growing into our divinity, you could say, our capacity to embody our divine nature, our true nature, our higher selves, in that process, we miss the mark. We make mistakes. The pendulum swings from one extreme to another until we find a true center where the soul opens like a grail, like we talked about in the last podcast, to receive the divinity of our spirit essence. I have found a definition of humility that is so empowering, and it's something I remind myself of constantly. I believe that true humility is about being all that we are and nothing we are not. Let me say that again. True humility is about being all that we are, every bit of it, every gift, every skill, every truth, and nothing we are not. No performing, no people pleasing, no trying to be something that we think others need us to be, no trying to fit in. To be humble is to not inflate ourselves with a false sense of power. This would be through things like projections. And yes, when we project our own power and inner authority onto someone else, like a guru, we are giving away our own power. And we're aligning with a false sense of power that makes us feel better because we're giving that to someone else and we feel favored by that. Or maybe we have a guardedness that makes us feel, I'm fine, I can do it all myself. Or maybe we're performing, trying to show up in the right way. It could also, this false power, this sense of inflation can show up in egotism, of course, and selfish alignments. But what we really want is to simply stand in what's true, what's real. It's also humble when we release false powerlessness, just as it is humble when we release false power. False powerlessness is the belief that we're small. That's that false humility I was mentioning. When we believe we're less than, when we're unworthy, when we're filled with self-doubt, when we have this sense of invisibility and we're not willing to be seen, or we're being totally compliant always and not questioning anything. We don't want to upset the apple cart, right? We're taught false humility as sinners being unworthy. And yet, ultimately, we just miss the mark. And it's through mistakes, through the willingness to mess up and make mistakes, that we grow, that we evolve in our consciousness. It's not through being small and playing small that we get that. False humility is actually a refusal to take responsibility for our own gifts and our own worth. True humility is a sense of accurate, embodied self-knowledge, seeing what is ours to claim and what is not ours to claim. True humility is not making yourself smaller than you are. True humility involves the courage to stand exactly as who you actually are. No more, no less. So I want to offer something that we can begin to look at It's this notion of outer influences that can kind of give us a hint of what we need to work toward to help us claim more of our true selves. Now, we might notice that we have a frustration toward another. That is not necessarily a problem. It actually can just be information. Because most likely, whatever we're frustrated about out there, the person, the situation, the circumstance, is something that lives within us also. And I'm not saying this to say, oh, you created your own reality, or it's all your fault, or, you have that too, and that we shouldn't be frustrated about things out there. But our frustrations, the things that trigger us, they give us information. They give us guidance about what really matters to us, what we really care about. And we can use them as awareness building, not self-blame. When we think about the idea of projecting, this is in more of a Jungian sense. This is when we give qualities to others that kind of activate us, qualities that we put on others. And so those might be, we could say, positive qualities or negative qualities. I like to think of things in terms of just qualities, period. I don't like to think in terms of polarities, good, bad, right, wrong. It just is, and it's all information. So these qualities that might activate us in others often live somewhere within us. These might be disowned or unexpressed aspects of ourselves. This might be the very shadows that are asking to be revealed. And we can go into shadow territory in another episode. Let me know in the comments if that's something you'd like. But the shadow territory is both dark and golden. When we're willing to go to those depths, when we're willing to kind of mine for that information, we can discover the darker shadows that hold us back, the ways that we put things on others, we don't take responsibility, we don't find things within ourselves. Or we can also find the golden shadow, the things that maybe we've been pushing aside and ignoring because we thought we needed to in order to survive on some level in the first half of life, that are ready to be brought forth as our true gifts. When we do this, when we turn inward in this way, when we go on that descent into shadow territory, we begin to find compassion for ourselves and for others. The frustration softens. We're not locked into the other or the outside circumstance as the problem. This compassion becomes possible for ourselves, others, and all of life. Everything begins to soften, and it makes forgiveness possible. Forgiveness is technically another emptying, a release of what we've been holding against ourselves and others. And yes, forgiveness of ourselves is part of it. What frustrates or triggers us in the outer wilderness is almost always pointing to something we have yet to claim in our inner wilderness. That's not something to beat ourselves up about, but something to explore as an invitation to go deeper and to remember more of who we really are. And just as our other keys to reclaim your soul are associated with the chakras, the root key being connected with the root chakra, the empty key being connected with the sacral chakra, the claim key is connected with our solar plexus chakra. And that allows us to open that chakra. We're really looking at clearing these energy centers within our body. The solar plexus chakra, when it's blocked, is part of what generates all that self-doubt, that questioning, that lack of confidence. And so working with the claim key helps us to open that up. So what does this actually look like? How do we begin to claim what's ours without slipping into false humility in the form of false power or false powerlessness? Well, there's a practice for this that I want to share with you, and it is in the 7 Keys guide. Sometimes having the ability to be walked through it can be really helpful. So let's take a moment to walk through how we can begin claiming what is truly already ours. Now, ideally, you'll pause what you're doing for just a few moments. We'll come back to your day in a bit. It's not going to take very long. I always try to do things that can be super simple, super applicable to the moment, to the day, to your day-to-day lives. So for a moment, just maybe receive a breath and soften in your body. We're not trying to solve anything right now. We just want to notice. We just want to be with ourselves, be in this moment. our feet on the ground, our breath moving through us. Our root key and our empty key helped us to do this. And I want you to maybe tap into a recent situation or person that draws up animosity or frustration or resentment in you. And just sit with it. Just be with what it is that's bothering you. Maybe give a moment to name what you don't like. Be specific. And without judgment, just ask yourself, is it possible that some of what I see out there also lives within me? Maybe there's something disowned within myself or unexpressed. Or maybe it's showing up in a different form. I like to think sometimes these things show up in as if we are in a fun house, with these mirrors that invert and twist and reshape, because sometimes that is how the mirrors in our outer world are reflected within us. It doesn't look exactly the same, but there's an element of it that still lives within us. Notice what rises up. Is there defensiveness? Is there a sense of recognition? Maybe a bit of sadness or grief. Maybe you feel a sense of relief, like, oh, I never saw that before. And maybe something releases in you. You could also ask yourself, have I ever hurt myself in a similar way to how I feel hurt by this outer situation? Often that's where we find the real meat of things. Have I hurt myself in this way? A lot of times the mirrors that we see in the world are trying to reflect back to us the ways in which we treat ourselves more than anything. And we might ask, what might compassion ask of me here? For myself, for them, for life? Now, we can invert this too. Like I said, I don't like to think in terms of right, wrong, good, bad. It's really about information. So similarly, just as you considered someone or something that frustrated or irritated you or triggered you, you could take a moment to consider someone you admire. Maybe someone that you tend to put on a pedestal a bit. What draws you in? What qualities are the things you admire so much? And then you can ask yourself, without dismissal, with full possibility, where or how do those qualities live in me? Even in small ways. What would it mean to begin trusting those qualities in myself and not only in another? To realize that if I'm seeing those qualities out there and recognizing them, there's something of them in me. One of my favorite, most powerful ways to do this work is through something called dialogue journaling. And it's actually like writing back and forth, soul to soul, with the person or situation or the part of yourself that needs to be heard or communicated with to find deeper understanding. And it's like kind of writing in a script, me, other person, or me, part of myself. And you literally just trust what comes. Now, if that practice is new to you, I have a free journaling workbook that walks through this method, along with several other journaling methods. And the link for that is also in the description. Completely free tool. It's called the Journaling as a Path to Come Home workbook. Additionally, while I'm on this notion of free gifts, another free gift I have is my balance and empowerment cards that offer deep information and ideas about the concept of false power and false powerlessness, which you'll also find a link to in the description. Now let's return to the body. Feel yourself here. Take what surfaced as information and guidance, an element of reclamation, not the whole of it. There's work to be done. Remember, I said this is a journey. This is a process. It requires practice. We want to keep noticing. We want to do it in ordinary, everyday moments. We can do this by catching ourselves when we start thinking we have to call or email or ask a whole bunch of friends and others about something and a decision we're trying to make, rather than stopping and pausing and asking our soul first. We can explore and practice deciding from our own knowing, noticing the rightness of it, even when others disagree, Because when you start to really believe in the rightness of your own knowing, your own intuitive wisdom, you get better and better at trusting it. We don't trust ourselves partly because we keep dismissing ourselves. We keep abandoning ourselves. We want to see when we encounter something that causes frustration or triggering in us, how we might turn inward with curiosity before reacting. That's another great way to practice in the day-to-day. And one of the most simple ways to use this claim key to reclaim more of our true empowerment is to simply receive a compliment with thank you. Instead of deflecting, oh no, that's too much, no. And speaking of no, it can be a complete sentence. And so when you practice saying no thank you to something that is offered to you or something someone wants to give to you or something someone wants you to do, and you don't have any more capacity for it, you don't have a desire for it, you don't have an interest in it, saying no thank you, and just standing in it, feeling your feet, feeling that ground beneath you, knowing that you are filling yourself up with your own truth, your own confidence, it's perfectly acceptable. You don't owe anyone an explanation. We could do a whole other episode on that too. You could also just look in the mirror every day. We do anyway, right? We do our hair, we do our makeup, we do we get ready for the day, and most of us look in the mirror, but we don't really look at ourselves. But we could take a moment to look at ourselves and value ourselves every single day. Truly looking ourselves in the eyes and saying, you're worthy. For some of us, that's a pretty tough call. Very difficult exercise. What so many people refer to as finding ourselves was never really finding. It was always about remembering. And the idea of becoming empowered was never really becoming. It was always about claiming what's been ours all along. Now, you may be noticing underneath all of this is a slight discomfort. Maybe the question of worthiness is coming up. Do I have the right to claim anything at all? Can I really do this? Oh, I don't think that would be right if I did something like that. I'm not strong enough for that. This question is so important that it probably does deserve its own episode. And if that's something you'd like to hear more about, please do share that in the comments. Let me know. It helps me to know what to bring next on these episodes. Now, this notion of claiming who we truly are is the third of the 7 keys to reclaim your soul. We root first, we empty second, and then we begin to claim more of who we truly are and how our soul was meant to travel its authentic journey. Each key prepares us for the next. If something in today's conversation met you, there are a number of tools available to you in the description, completely free, including the 7 keys to reclaim your soul, which walks you through all 7 keys: root, empty, claim, love, articulate, intuit, and midwife, each with its own audio reflection and practice, as well as the journaling guide and the balance and empowerment cards I mentioned. Claiming what is yours is not loud or aggressive. It does not require you to become someone you are not. It simply asks that you stop being someone you are not. And to remember the beautiful soul you've always been. I want you to picture a woman who stands comfortably rooted in her body, free of all unnecessary baggage. She finally stops questioning who she's allowed to be, and she begins in small, ordinary, everyday ways to be herself, the beautiful soul she's always been. That woman is you. Next time, we move into the 4th key, love. Not the love we've been sold, but the wisdom-infused love that becomes possible only after we've begun to claim ourselves, because we cannot truly love from a soul we are still abandoning. Until next time, keep tuning in to the language of soul, because soul knows the way.